for those new to the clinic, this is the end of the semester here, and it's the end of a lot of work for our 12 students in this room who have been working on 4 different projects. So the clinic here is part of the broader Trade Lab network of clinics, and we've had 4 clinics here in Geneva, but in parallel there's been 3 clinics in Qatar, 3 other clinics in Canada, and of our clinics here, only one of them is open to the public. Thanks to Untitled and Alexi, we're very proud and happy we can share this with you. For those of you who don't know what clinics, legal clinics are, it's basically a way to train our students at the Graduate Institute. So what we do is we put 3 students to a real-life problem, a project, submitted to us by an international organization, an NGO, a country mission, you name it, or a small business. And of course the students work on this project pro bono under the supervision of a professor, myself, Professor Anna Saab, or Fuad Zarbayev, who is not yet with us, and then assisted also by mentors, and they could be officials working with the WTO, law firm specialists, a diversity of experts helping out the students. And today is the culmination of many discussions, many presentations, many first, second, third, fourth drafts, and feedback from all of us. The final work product that the students will present for feedback, and then yet another version that will come out in January. And even if projects are confidential, we try to always put a non-confidential version on the website. So if you go to tradelab.org, you will see dozens of memos, some of them longer than others, but this one as well hopefully will make it one day onto the website. So I'll let the team introduce themselves, and then perhaps also ask Alexi to say a few words before we kick off. But you know the drill, you have 25 minutes, and then we can open to questions. So please.
Good afternoon. My name is Vandana Gyanchandani. I am from India. I am first year master's student in the Graduate Institute. This is my first semester, and I did my bachelor's in law from India, and I'm pursuing master's in international law from the Graduate Institute.
Oh, are we doing this? Okay. I'm Dario Giselli. I'm a PhD student in international law here. I studied law. I have a degree in law from the University of Siena in Italy and a Master of Science from London School of Economics. And yeah, I think that's it.
My name is Rana El Kahouki. I am from Egypt, and I did my law degree in Egypt, and then I did my LLM, and now I'm pursuing my PhD at Harvard Law School. I'm here as an exchange student for the whole year.
Okay. So perhaps before you start the project, it may be good if Alexi just puts this a little bit into context, where it comes from, what UNCTAD's take on this is.
Well, first of all, it's not the first time that we work together with the Trade Lab, with the youth and the students. Always a pleasure. Always a nice surprise, the quality. Invariably surprised with the quality of the work done. In this particular case, what prompted this arrangement, and I must admit that we have benefited from this arrangement more than we contributed to, for a variety of reasons. What prompted this arrangement was obviously the Paris Agreement, by NDCs that turned into NDCs in Paris, which for most of us, at least at UNCTAD in the trade division, is an uncharted territory. So we thought perhaps in the first instance, as a first step, we'll try and map out this territory, NDCs, using trade as a marker. It turned out that using trade as a marker is a non-starter, because trade doesn't register in NDCs. But still we thought we should somehow try and bring some order in our impression, in our knowledge about NDCs, and that's what the Trade Lab has helped us with. Now we have this map, and we're now thinking what's the best way for us to add value to this excellent work that has been done. What we have in mind more specifically is an ad hoc expert meeting sometime in April. And I don't know about Dario and the students are going to be still around. I hope you will. Well, we'll find a way of somehow inviting you and having you at this meeting. And we thought we might revisit this at this meeting. In parallel, we're commissioning other studies that look into the interplay between the response measures, economic diversification, trade, and we hope that at the intersection of all these various initiatives, we'll be able to find, able to come to interesting, practical conclusions. There's an added advantage for us to deal with the Trade Lab, because in UNCTAD, we have this understanding, we try to, when we look into trade measures, we try to focus on the economic and environmental effectiveness, setting aside the legality, setting aside the question of whether they're compatible or not compatible with the WTO regime. So we're focusing on the environmental and economic effectiveness and their trade effects. So that's why for us, having the Trade Lab to look, to have a look at the same problem, but more from a legal perspective, is a very welcome additional dimension of the work that we're doing at UNCTAD. So again, thank you very much. My apologies, we should have contributed more than we did. It was a difficult year for us, but I wish we could continue working together on this going forward, keeping in mind this meeting in April, which in turn will contribute to the UNFCCC ad hoc group in May. It's a very special technical group which was established in Marrakesh, and UNCTAD has been invited to nominate 2 experts to this group to help UNFCCC parties deal with issues arising at the intersection of response measures, economic diversification, and trade. So that's all I wanted to say. Used to thank you so very much. Cannot thank you enough, and look forward to working with you.
Good. Very good. I think we have a very nice group of people in the room as well, so we should take the most from the brain power in the room today. So if I may, and I know this takes a bit of your time, but it will be useful, if you could just state your name and your affiliation or the degree you're in. I think that will make it even more enriching, and we know where all of us are coming from. So I'm Jos Pauwelijn, a professor here at the Graduate Institute in International Law.
I am Cece Tan. I'm working with the Trade and Environment Division of the WTO.
Hello, I'm Ho Lim, Director of Trade and Environment Division at WTO.
I'm Daniel Ramos. I'm a legal officer at the Trade and Environment Division of the WTO.
Hello, I'm Irina Kiku. I'm a master's student here, second year.
Hello, my name is Juan Herrera from Ecuador. I'm studying the Master in International Dispute Settlement.
I'm Marta Piazza, second year master student International Law.
Ivan Renanga, also a second year master student International Law and part of the law.
Hello, I'm Panos Thellaropoulos. I'm from Athens, Greece, and I follow the Master in International Dispute Settlement.
I'm Abisari Adenobi. I'm a first year student in the Masters in International Law program here, also part of the clinic on a different project.
My name is Manuel Sanchez. I'm a second year PhD student in International Law.
Hi, I'm Zoe Zhang from Canada in the LLM program here at the Graduate Institute.
Teresa Carpenter, I'm the Executive Director of the Centre for Trade and Economic Integration here at the Institute.
Yan Shang, NGO Queens Shenyang International. It's animal rights linked to human rights.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Mattes Weller. I'm with UNCTAD as well. I recently joined as an Associate Economic Affairs Officer in the Trade Logistics branch at UNCTAD.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hui Zhuang, and I'm a lawyer from Vanpao and Belis.
I'm Ariane Vincent, second year student in the Master in International Law program here and also part of the clinic.
My name is Sylvia, and I'm a master student for the international law and disbursement.
My name is Nivedita. I'm a first year PhD in law student here, and I'm also a part of this clinic.
Hi, I'm Sonia Hawkins. I'm Program Officer for Climate and Trade Policy at ICTSD here in Geneva.
Hi, my name is Alexander Castro, and I'm Senior Advisor on Climate Change and Biodiversity at ITC, International Trade Center here in Geneva.
Hi, my name is Anne Saab. I'm Assistant Professor in the International Law Department here at the Institute.
Please.
My name is Peter Lunenborg. I'm with the trade program of the South Center here based in Geneva.
Eugenia Nunez, I work at UNTAD with MSN.
Good afternoon, I'm Claire Device. I work here at the EU delegation and also deal with trade and environment.
I'm Jian, and I'm an intern at the Companion Commission to WTO.
My name is Edward Gardner. I'm an intern in the economics team of the UK mission to the UN and WTO.
I am Angelica Zarinelli, working here at the Center for Economic Integration as a data coordinator.
Wonderful. So no pressure on you guys. We're all the experts in the room, but take it away.
Chuck, you didn't introduce yourself.
Switch it over. All right. All right. Okay.
Actually, I've always had
that
there were more than three.
All right. I'm Chaku. I'm the teaching assistant for the clinic. And okay, so we'll start the session very soon.
My name is Vandana, and together with Dario and Rana, we worked on this project which was granted by UNCTAD. It relates to climate change and trade. In the context of this project, as was provided earlier, that UNCTAD aims to promote synergies between climate change and trade, which promotes economic diversification. Our project was divided into three parts. Part one of the mandate was to map trade-related response measures from 162 INDCs that were submitted by countries to the UNFCCC. Part two of the mandate was to describe the majority of response measures that were related to trade and its connection and the interplay with economic diversification. Part three of the mandate was to describe the incorporation of climate-related response measures in free trade agreements. So this is the conceptual model of our project. It provides as to why is it important to deal with these three concepts together, that is trade, response measures and economic diversification. On the one hand, response measures can either be trade supportive or trade restrictive and can either promote or hinder economic diversification. On the other hand, trade rules provide the conditions under which response measures and economic diversification can be mutually supportive. When we were going through 162 countries' INDCs, we realized that there was no uniformity in the formatting of such INDCs that were submitted. So we came up with our own mapping format given the similarities in the INDCs, and these are the categories under which or through which we mapped the INDCs. The categories include measures related to energy sector, green industrial policies, green government procurement, financial and direct trade measures, which includes subsidies, carbon pricing, taxation, research and development. Lastly, international cooperation, which includes climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. This is an example of the state-to-state mapping of the INDC that we completed. This is Republic of Ghana's INDC mapping. The main findings of this mapping exercise was that developing and least developed countries, majority of them had transparent and coherent INDCs, which reflected their hope for international cooperation. On the contrary, the developed countries' INDCs were general and were hard to assess. Secondly, there was a prevalence of trade-related measures in the INDCs, which was a boost for our purpose, our project. Thirdly, some measures in the INDCs, which were trade-related, were hypothetical. That is, it really depended, like their direct correlation with trade was depending on the domestic implementation. Lastly, there is a need for future harmonization of INDC formatting in order to avoid incoherent commitments and unnecessary information. After we completed state-to-state mapping of INDCs, we also analyzed the INDCs in terms of issues. The issues, as listed in the slide here, are taxes, subsidies, import bans, tariffs and import duties, green government procurement, which was majorly linked to public transportation, public buildings, public lighting. And since I have presented this part one of our mandate, Dario will now present to you how these response measures, which you can see in the slide, within the issues, how these response measures have an interplay with economic diversification or boost economic diversification. On the last point, this issue mapping of response measures was done by noting the state-to-state mapping of the country's INDCs, then grouping the response measures under these appropriate categories to complete the issue mapping.
So thank you, Vandana. Thank you, everybody. After mapping the trade-related commitments in the INDCs, we thought that economic diversification provided a very useful lens for expanding and building upon this analysis, discussing the synergies and tensions emerging between climate and trade. This is because, of course, response measures have impacts, not only domestic, but also cross-border impacts on countries' economies. And this is particularly true for developing countries, but more in general, we have to hold that response measures enacted in one country go beyond the border of the country in terms of environmental effects, social effects, economic effects. And slowly moving towards this concept of economic diversification, we need to identify who's going to feel these impacts. And of course, we have many countries, developing countries, particularly small island developed states, least developed countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, that to this date experience high dependence on a narrow range of carbon-intensive sectors or fossil fuel production. These countries are going to feel the impacts of implementing their response measures for a variety of reasons. Because climate and energy policies in energy importing countries can create barriers to trade, can negatively affect carbon-intensive imports. Because we are bound probably to see border tax adjustments that will be enacted to deal with the loss of competitiveness of domestic industries in the light of course, climate change mitigation policies. because we're going to see a broader loss of competitiveness driven by higher standards, labeling requirements, subsidies, production subsidies specifically, and also more in general because we are probably going also to see a shift in consumers and investor preferences further affecting competitiveness, creating problems in terms of unemployment and labor market rigidities and so on and so forth. But the thing is, response measures might also have positive impacts in two words, as we were saying, economic diversification. This is because economic diversification as a concept has, of course, come to be closely associated with the concept of innovation, the concept of high value added sectors, technology transfer, and so on and so forth. So economic diversification in this context provides the ideal link. It's a very useful trading framing device. It has been discussed for years within the UNFCCC framework, but mainly in two contexts. One was adaptation, so the need to reduce reliance on vulnerable sectors in these countries or increasing resilience, and the other from the point of view of response measures, so reducing the adverse impacts of these climate change mitigation policies as we just discussed. But over time, this perception changed. As we moved forward towards the Paris Agreement, and especially because of the bottom-up approach of the Paris Agreement to climate change mitigation through the use of the nationally determined contributions, economic diversification has come to be closely associated with response measures through a sort of a light of a positive opportunities, a mutual supportiveness between the two goals. First of all, because it's important for the economies that are driven by the sectors that are vulnerable, but also because economic diversification has mitigation co-benefits. These opportunities, as I said, are pretty much emphasized and made bigger by the opportunity of the Paris Agreement. So we looked again at the mapped trade-related measures to also see what we might see in terms of potential relations with economic diversification. So we went again through the mapping categories. We tried to identify some meaningful examples throughout the different sectors. As we see, many of these things being related to trade are heavily related to economic diversification too. There's no need to go in depth about them. Just a quick notation. It has been very helpful to read the INDCs of many developing countries because they have seen and they have, of course, started to frame their action in terms of what also the opportunities for diversification were. So it was, you're not going to see many commitments from developed countries here. So this is also a sort of very schematic representation of the whole thing. But just to say that the interplay between diversification and response measures in the INDCs is very complex. You're going to have domestic effects, which might be positive, which might be uncertain, which might be negative, and cross-border effects, which are pretty much uncertain and mixed, because much of this, basically all of this, is going to depend on two things. One, the design of domestic policies that are going to implement response measures at the domestic level, and also because many of these things might, if enacted unilaterally, might create the potential for very big tensions for the economic diversifications of other countries. So that emphasized the need for international cooperation in the implementation of definition and implementation of response measures if we are to see mutually supportive regimes in this field. So the scope of the current INDCs and NDCs to promote diversification is there. We see that as we've seen, many of these things are going to create opportunities in terms of increasing competition, in terms of increasing opportunities for exports, and so on and so forth, particularly at the domestic level. At the cross-border level, this effect, as I said, is more mixed because in many cases we might be able to see domestic measures which try to shield infant industries or create local content requirements as a mean of promoting domestic industries, which can be particularly threatening for the export diversification opportunities of some developing countries. So the final notation here is that these analysis of the INDCs reveals how trade policy and international cooperation are extremely important in ensuring this mutual supportiveness. On the one hand, we see response measures that can promote diversification, but only if they take the international trade regimes into account. Most of the adverse effect of response measures will be felt through the mechanisms of trade, because we are going to see a loss or of market share, of market access, or market creation, or increasing opportunities for market access. And because trade liberalization is probably one of the main drivers of import and export diversification, and especially if we think of trade liberalization and environmental goods and services, this is going to provide, of course, the biggest opportunities. In turn, trade rules should be made more supportive of diversification through response measures. We have to think in terms of the policy space then trade regimes can provide to subsidize or nudge this shift towards diversification. We have to make sure that the rules are and the policies at the domestic level are carefully designed and take into account a trade regime which prevents them from being protectionist. And also we have to make sure that trade rules facilitate as much as possible technology transfer and the shift to new technologies. This is why we, of course, decided to look at what the biggest field at the moment is. Of course, the biggest proliferation of free trade agreements throughout the world, which my colleague Johanna is going to talk about.
Thank you. So now that we have looked into the commitments of countries under the INDCs and the NDCs, we are going to dig deeper into the trade rules and into the free trade agreements to see how countries have incorporated their climate change commitments into trade and free trade agreements. We have noticed that there are two different ways of incorporation. There is a direct incorporation when states explicitly include climate measures into FTAs, and there is also indirect incorporation by providing policy spaces, and countries do that when they draft their general and specific exceptions into these free trade agreements. So let's start with the methodology. In this section, we did not do a mapping of the free trade agreements. We used the mapping that is done by Professor Jean-Frédéric Morin. He provided the Trade and Environment Database Codebook, which is a set of environmental provision, 300 different type of environmental provision that are mapped in 660 different trade agreements. In this project, Professor Morin have identified the provisions, and the first time that this provision was included in an FTA, and then the level of diffusion of these kind of measures. In addition to this codebook, we've also looked into the Comprehensive Trade and Economic Agreement between the EU and Canada, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. So, yes, these environmental protection provisions in FTAs, they differ considerably between the different FTAs, but they all have something in common. They basically cover these six issue areas that I have on this slide. These different areas that have covered the right of parties to regulate the level of environmental protection, the non-derogation commitment, which means that countries cannot derogate from their environmental protection rules for trade and investment purposes, the means to encourage climate change commitment by promoting renewable energy, clean energy, setting international standards, other general and specific exceptions, and dispute settlement mechanism. All of these provisions shows the complementarity role that free trade agreements can play in the climate change mitigation obligations. And as stated in many scholarly work and also by Professor Morin, that these free trade agreements, not only they help climate change, but also they can offer a stricter and clearer, more precise commitments on climate change, given that They include less less states in the negotiations, and they cover much more broader topics, and therefore they allow for bargaining and issue linkages that can actually promote climate change by incorporating those climate change provisions inside the FTAs. So in this slide, we have identified the most important climate-related measures included in the FTAs. And of course, these are just one example for each measure, but in the report we have much more examples that cover a wide area of free trade agreements. First, there are policies that promote the production, trade, and investment in environmental goods and services. And some of those policies include reducing tariffs on the trade and investment in environmental goods and services, which not only is helpful for climate change by incentivizing producers to switch to less carbon-intensive production processes, it also helps with economic diversification, as Dario has explained. Countries have relied on two different strategies with regard to environmental goods and services. They either cover a wide-ranging area of these goods and services, or they specify solar panels or hybrid vehicles. There are no uniform way of doing that. Each countries have their own strategy to adopt in this measure. The second measure is subsidy reform for green energy, and subsidy reform also exists in two different types. First type is to grant subsidies to green technologies, or to anything related to R&Ds that are related to green technologies, or to eliminate subsidies from those harmful products for the environment, like fossil fuels. So it's either granting subsidies or eliminating subsidies. The other type is, in addition to all those economic and financial measures that we just have seen now, there are also non-trade barriers that were used by countries in certain FTAs that include setting of standards, technical regulation, conformity assessment. They also provide a way for states to advance climate change by specifically asking producers to label their efficient, friendly products, and this will incentivize the producers as well as the consumer to use those products that are environmentally friendly. And finally, the international cooperation that we have seen in almost all the FTAs that we've looked at, that provides for developing countries to get a technical assistance, capacity building, and climate finance from developed countries. The other way of this kind of incorporation is the indirect incorporation, which means that in most of the free trade agreements that we have looked at, we found that there are two main categories of exceptions. So free trade agreements, either they adopt the WTO-style general exceptions, which covers the different environmental or public health or animal and plant health kind of exceptions, or they actually provide for specific exceptions to go even beyond what is known in the WTO, and to, for instance, in the Canada-Peru FTA that we provided here, there is an exception to actually not adopt a technical regulation that is kind of related to the TBT agreement in case of urgent problem to safety, health, and environmental protection. So in some instances, we have found that free trade agreements have moved beyond what the WTO GATT Article 20 style have adopted into other kind of specific exceptions. So to sum up and go back to our conceptual framework and to show you what are the final findings of this project. First of all, we have noticed that there are a high number of response measures in the INDCs with a potential interaction with the international trading system. Secondly, response measures show a potential of a positive contribution to economic diversification, and this all depends on the domestic implementations of this measure and the trade rules that are going to interact with these response measures. And finally, free trade agreement can serve as positive drivers for the implementation of the response measures, either by incorporating climate-related commitments in an explicit way or by ensuring mutual supportiveness between trade, climate change mitigation, and economic diversification. Thank you so much for listening, and we're looking forward for your questions and comments.
Thank you. Very good. So it's a rather positive story. Most people would think two ships passing in the night, trade environment, but you found a lot of trade elements in the national commitments and a lot of environmental elements in the FTA. So, Alexia, I don't know whether you want to have a first go at comments or elements you want to clarify or questions you have.
Well, first of all, it's a surprise, admittedly a nice one, because as I mentioned, if you use trade as a marker and you sift through the various NDCs, there's nothing much you can come. You have to exercise your imagination, right? And well, obviously your imagination is not poor, because the conclusion you've come to. But one interesting question that was posed in a recent meeting in Doha, Qatar. As a matter of fact, it was the first expert meeting organized by UNFCCC after Paris. To rethink, re-engineer, if you like, what they call in the UNFCCC parlance the improved forum on response measures. Again, the decision was taken in Paris, and under this improved forum on response measures, they set up an ad hoc technical expert group. The decision was taken in Marrakesh, as I mentioned, and in this meeting in Doha, it was entirely devoted to two priorities, what the parties for the moment tend to see as the priorities for the work of this improved forum. One is economic diversification, which is not something new. It's been on the radar screen of the UNFCCC for a long time. And the other is what they call, again in the parlance, very specific one, just social transition, and it's a long sentence. Which is more about the social, it's about jobs to be gained or lost as a result of the implementation of NDCs. And in the discussion on economic diversification, an interesting question was posed by the World Bank, the leader of the climate policy team at the bank. He said, well, we have response measures and we have the economic diversification. Is there an overlap? Or to put it differently, can you say, when you deploy response measures, can you say that you actually, you're doing economic diversification? And vice versa. You're doing economic diversification, not even necessarily with the climate policy objectives in mind, but can a posteriori you sort of account for this economic diversification as a response measure, as a way to accomplish, to deliver on your NDC's commitment. And we found this question very intriguing. It's not about juxtaposing response measures and economic diversification. It's about looking for the interplay, for the overlap, and perhaps even changing our perception about. I recall used our discussion, last time, which was a little frightening to me because you said something about definitions. And as someone who had gone through the painful experience of the negotiations on environmental goods and services, and it was essentially about defining, negotiating definitions rather than defining negotiations. So obviously we don't want to repeat this, history, but the history is being repeated, right? The last ministerial and the Chinese is trying to sell bicycles to Europe. you know, you're an avid cyclist. Have you seen a bicycle in Geneva that were not made in China? You know, I personally did. Anyway, that's an aside. But
bike is from Belgium, high quality.
Right.
For 20 years.
Yeah, but that's you know, just my personal frustration. You know, with the negotiating process, even now within the multilateral you know, context, framework. Who would have imagined that we would be reliving, you know, this quite nonsensical experience in the WTO? But what I was going to say, without, you know, without the risk of getting bogged down in the definitional debate about response measures versus diversification, would it be a good idea to explore, you know, the changing relationship, let's put it this way, between the two?
I don't know whether you want to respond to this or
no, yeah, that's what basically guided the entire work, because this sort of discourse was very prominent in Doha, as you emphasized, and we were by then already working on the mapping, and then so it was more about analyzing trade and response measures. But then when you add economic diversification in there, which was something that we discussed just after the first part of the mapping, it sort of assumes a whole new light, because all the possibilities for these positive synergies emerge, and trade appears as basically the determinant of whether this equivalence is going to be true or not. So that made the analysis, I think, for the second part extremely more interesting from a certain perspective.
Okay, so normally we would then open up, first of all, to the supervising professor. I don't know, Anna, whether you have any comments. You've read the latest draft, whether you've already communicated with them, but...
Well, I mean, I guess I'm happy to leave the floor to other people, because I've been much more involved with the project, so it's not a big surprise to me, where I think, if that's okay, I would be happy for other people to get a chance to...
Yeah, let's open it up then to people who, well, you haven't seen the larger report. It's what, 80 pages long? So this
if you add the country summaries of the mapping, it's kind of, it will probably be around 300 pages, but that's just the summaries. You don't have to read them. You might just read the mapping.
But interestingly, it's a very easy reading matter.
I was going to say that it is easy to read.
You know, because I hate volumes, you know, really. And we wouldn't have been able to do this, you know, so thank you very much again, and it's extremely helpful. Because right now I think we got ourselves, you know, probably virtual reality goggles with this study, you know, because we've been flying blind at a certain extent when we're talking about NDCs, but, you know, little information, little systematic, you know, information about the subject matter.
So let's open it up, including to people who have ideas on how to make better use of this, because I think the group would be the first ones to admit that really what they did was mapping, and now the question is, what can you do with this now that you've uncovered certain trade links in the national commitments and certain climate change links and the FTAs? Please.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very impressive. I look forward to reading the report. So ITC our main clients are small and medium enterprises in developing countries and trade support institutions around them. So we're concerned with how the business environment is structured and regulated to enable SMEs to compete more effectively. So my question would be, during the course of your research, did you come across, or do you have reflections upon what type of business environment would make it more favorable for SMEs to compete in developing countries as these response measures kick in and create challenges in, say, fossil fuel dependent industries and create opportunities in more sort of green economy type industries? And related to that, did you come across sort of reflections on the just transition, as the ILO calls it? So what the labour effects would be of this transition?
I think we try to sort of make use also of the work that the UNFCCC has been doing on just transition of the workforce and the creation of jobs. From a legal perspective, probably you can see just a sort of distant reflection of what is going on in terms of regulating trade and response measures. And that is also why I think that UNCTAD is putting a lot of emphasis on the economic analysis part of that, which is probably going to prove very helpful on that. Regarding the business environment, I think that what we are seeing, like the key component here is that if you're going about response measures through unilateral response measures, it's going to prove very hard to create these synergies and to favor a business environment which is conducive to this sort of relationship, because and countries of course have gone about designing their INDCs in a way which was good for them, which is important, but at the same time you see that some of these things, especially a lot of trade restrictive measures, import bans, some taxation policies, feed-in tariffs are probably going to create tensions, and going about some form of international cooperation, it's definitely important, not just technology transfer, but like some integration in that field.
Yes?
So thank you very much. I think it was I can see there's a lot of work involved, so I really congratulate you for having the energy to pursue it. As a trade person, I think that most of the trade policies that could be adopted to mitigate climate change, from my understanding of WTO law, these trade policies are already covered by the WTO agreements, and they could be already analyzed under that regime. I think that the new legal issues arise with respect to the regional trade agreements, and I think that in that group of new legal issues, I would highlight the exceptions that are contained in the regional trade agreements, and perhaps I would be interested to know what do you think about these WTO plus exceptions vis-a-vis the general exceptions or Article 24 and in the WTO regime. I mean, I think that should be definitely an issue that's worth digging, considering that a regional trade agreement only allows you to justify certain measures, certain type of measures, excluding, for example, subsidies. So perhaps, I don't know if this is something that you've already done, in which case I would be really interested in knowing your thoughts about it, and otherwise highlight it as a point for discussion for the future.
Yeah, definitely. I think this part about exceptions definitely need much more deep analysis, because we have only tried to look at the strategy that countries have adopted in the different FTAs, and it would be very helpful to really see in depth how countries have drafted, especially the specific exceptions, the WTO plus exceptions, because these free trade agreements are very recent. They have the Paris Agreement in mind now, so when they are drafting the exceptions, I think that including climate change as climate change mitigation commitments as part of the exception would be very beneficial for the future coherence between trade rules and climate change rules. So definitely this is going to be for future research purposes, of course. Thank you.
Please, yes.
Right. Thanks, yes. No, thanks very much, firstly, for this work. Really a good effort, and thanks for all the detail that you've gone into. I have not seen the report, of course, but sort of seen the slides here. Maybe just a couple of thoughts and maybe a little bit more on the specific exceptions. I think, just thinking about it conceptually, that yes, I think you're right, that once we go beyond the initial mapping and we start to look at how these NDCs are actually converted into measures and what these actual trade measures actually are, then we might have to deal with a lot more tension and more challenges in ensuring that mutual supportiveness. But of course, as to start, we need to have, as you have done, sort of an idea of the types of things that are coming on stream. So let's see. I wouldn't jump too quickly to say it's completely always going to be mutually supportive, but I hope it will be, but we will have to look at that. Another one, which is a little bit something I'm trying to puzzle with myself, because it's more conceptually on trade now and the concept of economic diversification. One of the consequences of trade, or more trade, is actually more economic specialization. So you would expect to see countries become more specialized, as opposed to this concept of economy being very diversified. So there is a little bit of, like, if you like, some sort of tension there between the tendency towards economic specialization, which I don't need to tell this audience, of course, is very much from the basic tenet of comparative advantage, towards specialization, versus the sort of idea of a more diversified economy. How do you achieve both? And I think maybe we're looking at it, although I know the language is economic diversification, it's more about more of an economic transformation. You're trying to transform the economy, and in that transformation, move towards a more sort of clean energy technologies, etc. So I would be concerned about using too much the analogy of economic diversification, because that can create in the minds of some that it's more about import substitution policies, where you protect and therefore you diversify your economy in this sense, where you produce everything. And what we're really looking at is towards more a more clever trade policy, towards more economic specialization, but specialization in a way that really opens up the range of market opportunities that one has. So, but these are more conceptual things that we can talk about. And the other one, which is just more a little sort of point, which, as you already said, deserves a bit more investigation, is on specific exceptions. On just a very brief glance on the slide, I wonder whether we are actually seeing any WTO plus exceptions here, or whether some of this is already captured within the TBT agreement in any case, on the specific one that you had on technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures. But of course, one has to look at the details, so I'm not saying that there are no WTO plus. There are some interesting TBT plus and WTO plus provisions in CETA, for instance, on TBT in particular. They're not related to climate change as such, they're very much a TBT aspect. But what is interesting there, just to mention, is a sort of dynamic relationship, that what you see there are, yes, TBT plus provisions, but they come from discussions that have already taken place in the TBT committee, particularly through the adoption of recommendations and guidelines, which then get transformed into sort of more binding obligations in the agreement. I think Danielle probably has more to say on the specific RTAs, because colleagues in the WTO have also done a study looking at RTAs and mapping out all the environmental provisions and this question of whether they are plus or not plus, or how you would categorize them. But all in all, I think it's very useful and very helpful. And on your point, Yus, about what can we do with this sort of information, I think the main one is dissemination, to disseminate it widely, and find ways to disseminate it, to bring it towards the WTO members or the trade community. I take the point that sometimes the members may not always see eye to eye on everything, but of course to help them understand the situation, this sort of report was very helpful to clarify more, and then if there's more questions, to raise this. And more specifically, just for your information, you may already know that there has been proposals in the Committee on Trade and Environment to have more dedicated discussions on trade and climate change. Now, that is a proposal. It's not accepted by all members, but those members who are interested do intend to go ahead with their discussions, and therefore this sort of information could be very helpful to them.
I wanted to just provide one information that we also saw the Eurasian Economic Union Agreement and the chapter on energy specifically, because when we're talking about climate change, we are looking at energy conservation, energy utilization in a more sustainable manner. what Eurasia is doing, what Eurasian Economic Union has done, because it has been ratified, is to look at the European Union energy configuration or energy union that they have. Because when we're talking about renewables, when we want to promote renewables, unless the energy that is being produced by renewables through solar, through wind, cannot be stored in that much of a capacity that it gets produced. So when you produce the energy, you need to transmit it to where it is required for early consumption and less consumption simultaneously of the traditional fossil fuel energy sources. For that, energy union plays a big role, because when a regional area gets connected through energy union, and you have power grids which are connected, as soon as France produces, say, solar energy, and Germany needs it, or Germany produces solar energy since it's a solar energy powerhouse, and France requires energy, not using the traditional sources, it can be easily transferred to, and trade has a role to play, because it's trade in energy that's going to take place when this happens. And climate change figures into the dynamics of trade and energy through energy conservation. So I would just like to have your thoughts on is UNCTAD, is WTO, are the organizations looking into the prospects of encouraging such energy unions, and in future might have regional interconnections of energy unions, which might really mitigate climate change, because maximum amount of greenhouse gas emissions happen through energy production, not through renewables.
Energy sector is a difficult one, because we don't really deal with it very clearly either I mean, it is, electricity is a good under trade in goods, but energy as a sector is not classified in services as a sector as such. There are services related or incidental to energy, or energy distribution more specifically, but this debate about energy and how it should be treated in WTO as a sector has not really been addressed by the members. I mean, it's not been looked at in terms of as a specific sector. There are horizontal agreements that do affect certain aspects of energy, and energy as a good or energy as a service required to generate more distribution actually of energy. I don't know, I mean, in the short term there isn't that much focus on this. The focus is actually on, by some members, is the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. Some have made that very known that that's their position, and they would like WTO to address that. So I think you're going to hear more debates on fossil fuel subsidy reform than necessarily on energy or energy unions as such. But that's just my take on it.
Can you just maybe a quick point to what you were saying earlier on tensions? We of course found a lot of tensions in there, especially in the mapping. Of course, you see a lot of trade restrictive measures, and both in a sort of direct way or potentially depending on the domestic measures. So I think in that case, we sort of try to frame the whole thing, as you were saying, like the main use of this is dissemination, like how we can sort of encourage a debate, which is a positive debate, and how you can link the things. And that's why we sort of, even those negative, potentially negative links, we try to say, okay, but depending on how you frame this, this can be an opportunity. And the other point on diversification, I absolutely agree with you on that concept. I think in the report, when you're going to read it, I hope so, there are also some references to this like long-term goal of decarbonization of the world economy, which is probably what the UNFCCC actually means. They use economic diversification, but with the goal of achieving the long-term economic transformation. So I absolutely share that point. Just for confirming some of these.
We are running a little over time already, but we can take a few more comments. Perhaps you don't have to necessarily respond, just to take advantage of the people in the room. Yes?
Yeah, to my knowledge, agriculture is one of the major CO2 emitters, depending on how you count it, whether you include land use or not. It's either number 1 or number 2 after the energy sector. So did you find, when you were doing the mapping of the NDCs, did you see any measures relating to agriculture that might involve trade restrictions?
Perhaps let's take a few more and then give you an opportunity. Teresa?
Yeah, I just want to say I find it quite encouraging because trade and environment have traditionally been two areas where governments have big turf wars and they do things that are kind of not really aware of what they're doing. But the way you described the new trade agreements, the fact that they're having Paris in mind when they're writing these, it sounds like quite positive that actually they're using trade agreements to push other countries to carry forward some of those commitments, and I think that's kind of a bit of a change. For me, that sounded new.
Well, but give it to trade lawyers and they will always find it. You already pointed it out. But no, I agree with you. I think it's, and of course it will also a bit the task to give it a positive spin, but it is actually quite encouraging. Please.
Yeah. Well, I would just join the question of the gentleman regarding the transport sector. So basically the same question is for the agriculture sector regarding transport sector fuel.
There's also the shadow students, because the way the clinic works is we did 4 projects on completely unrelated topics: e-commerce, fisheries, investment in Myanmar, and to make sure that everyone thinks about all of the projects, we put students as shadowers. So I don't know who are the shadowers for this one, Ivan, and yes, please, if you have ideas or...
Well, just thinking out loud here. When you were going through the FTAs, did you happen to come across something that would maybe suggest that these climate-related measures will sort of be upgraded to substantial obligations somehow? Since all, from what I have seen, these provisions use language such as share the goal, pay special attention, or facilitate, which are not really just commitments after all, but any indication to these moving forward to being hard or obligation.
Yeah, I have a related question on technical assistance. You mentioned international cooperation and the way in which technical assistance was framed within FTA. So do you think that it was framed specifically in a specific way as to commit states to do that? It's a little bit related to the first question, but this was my main concern.
Please.
On the FTA mapping, I would be interested in hearing a bit more about the environmental goods and services. What kind of RTAs included this? I assume it's like front-loading tariffs, and if it's RTAs including developing countries.
Okay, let's end on this and give you an opportunity to respond to some of those.
Yeah, agriculture was specifically excluded from the work that we were doing, but looking at, we've done the mapping, so we've seen a lot of these measures. Agriculture features a lot in terms of adaptation, climate smart agriculture, all these sorts of discussions. You do see countries are very careful in mentioning trade with respect to agriculture, and then that's even more true in the INDCs. While on transportation, it was we didn't try to map specifically the sectors, but some of the measures we do, when you talk about standards, many countries mention standards specifically in connection with transportation or buildings, for example. You see quite a few examples of green government procurement practices that they mention in connection with transportation and buildings. And of course, also in terms of, there are some examples in some of the smaller countries in terms of import bans with certain, polluting cars. So there are quite a few examples there. Yeah.
So for the legal obligations for both Ivan and Marta's questions, actually had a conversation with Professor Paulin about how legally binding, not just the FTAs on environment, but also the NDCs and INDCs, because to this moment, we're not 100% sure when countries are drafting those INDCs, whether they think these are legally binding under international law or not. But I think that most of them for now are not. But I'm just not an expert on this, and I didn't do my research on it. But I agree with you. Most of the language used in the FTAs was shall and facilitate. We didn't really find any hard commitments that are legally binding. And for the environmental goods and services question, we actually did not do the mapping of the FTAs. We relied on a project that is done by Professor Jean-Frédéric Moin. I can give you the information because he did the mapping and we only used the analysis, so I cannot tell you how many agreements have used it, but if you check his website, you can get the information on specifically the provisions on the production, like the policies promoting production of environmental goods and services, and policies promoting trade and investment in environmental goods and services.
Okay, wonderful. We'll have to end it here. Thank you so much to the group, to the other students, and also to the visitors. If any of you were inspired by the opportunities that the clinic provides, you can go online, tradelab.org, and submit projects. We will have another clinic series starting in September, and we'd be delighted to look into equally exciting projects like this one. So thank you very much for coming.